Whether you're just getting started with line and wash or you're looking to learn how to draw different types of flowers, this three-parter series is for you. There are so many different types of flowers out there in the world, but most of them fit into one of these 6 categories that I'm going to be sharing in this series. The 6 main types of flower shapes are circle, trumpet, bowl, bell, combination, and variation. In this first part of the series, I'm going to be teaching you how to draw the first 3, which are the circle flower, and for that one I'm going to be drawing a daisy. Then we're going to be moving on to the trumpet-shaped flower, and for that one we're going to be drawing a morning glory. And finally, we're going to be moving on to the bowl-shaped flower. And for that one, we're going to be drawing a peony. In part 2 of this series, which is coming up next week, I'll share how to draw the other 3 types of flowers. And then in part 3 of this series, we're going to be bringing everything together to draw and paint a complete flower bouquet. I'm going to be sharing how I personally like to practice drawing these different types of flowers in my sketchbook using a graphite pencil and then bringing in my pen before working on my final studies on my watercolor paper and bringing in the watercolor washes. And this is something that I would recommend you do as well, especially if you're just getting started with drawing flowers. This way, you can avoid doing too much erasing and muddying up your watercolor paper. Before getting into it, I want to say that this is great drawing practice for anyone because we get to develop 2 essential skills that will help us with any type of drawing. We're able to practice visualizing what 3D forms look like from different angles and perspectives, and also we get this opportunity to practice simplifying what we're seeing into basic shapes or forms. Both of these skills will help us with any kind of drawing that we choose to work on in the future. Another important thing that I want you to remember when drawing flowers is that when it comes to these 6 different flower shapes, that shape or little structure can be going off in different directions. So for some flowers, that trumpet is going to be facing up. For others, it's going to be facing down, and that is still a trumpet-shaped flower. Okay, remember that the orientation does not matter. It still has that basic shape. And another thing is that we can get confused because flowers can be closed or they can be more open when they are in full bloom. And that shape or structure changes. I don't want you to start overthinking things or start getting confused as to whether one flower is this shape or this other shape, because ultimately what matters most is that you're able to simplify what you're observing into basic shapes or forms, because it's through that simplification that you're going to be able to draw it successfully. So don't overthink it. If you're into this kind of thing and you don't want to miss the upcoming videos in this series, I would highly recommend subscribing to my channel. Alright, so let's jump in.
Let's start with the circle flower. I'm going to be drawing a daisy today, but in this category there are also chamomile flowers, sunflowers, etc. Circle flowers have a bit of a flatness to them. The thing that comes to mind is like a kitchen plate. There's a subtle curve to those petals, of course, but if you were to see this flower at a profile view, there would be a certain flatness to that petal area, especially when compared to other flower shapes that we're going to be practicing in this series. So what I did here was I drew a larger circle and a smaller concentric circle inside of that. This is meant to be like a top-down or flat view, so we would see circles in this particular case, but we will be talking about other perspectives in just a bit. Now, depending on the type of flower that you are drawing, that inner smaller circle might be smaller or larger. Some flowers have very teeny tiny central areas, and other flowers, like sunflowers for example, have huge central areas. And a huge tip that I want to provide is look at reference photos for the particular type of flower that you're trying to draw. Really notice those distinctive characteristics that set that flower apart from others, whether it's the petal shape, the number of petals, the size of the inner central area compared to the petals. All of these things are essential that you understand and try to capture in your drawing. I have a video that I shared a while back where I explain why it's so difficult to draw circles, ellipses, shapes with curves to them. In that video, I provide practical exercises that can help you improve your circles and ellipses. I'm going to make sure to leave a link to that video in the description box below in case you'd like to check it out. But as you can see, my circles that I started with, they're not perfect, and that is perfectly okay. Once my 2 circles were in, I started drawing the petal shapes. There is a lot of irregularity and imperfection involved when drawing or painting organic objects like flowers and plants. And as I was drawing the petal shapes, I didn't go clockwise or counterclockwise. I actually like skipping around, jumping around that entire larger circle as I am starting to fill that area in with petals. And I also make sure that I start capturing that irregularity and imperfection that I was talking about before, making sure that my petal shapes are overlapping over each other in different ways, even clustering together in different ways. It's very important as well as you're drawing all of these flowers that you make sure that the petals look like they are connected to that central area. This means that we have to draw that petal shape in all sorts of different angles and directions, which does require a little bit of practice, but this is exactly why I wanted you to practice in a separate sketchbook or drawing paper before we jump into the final ones. Once those basic shapes were in, it was time to switch to my drawing pen and start defining those outer edges of my shapes, as well as continue adding further detail and little textures. For this one, I added in a third smallest circle inside of that central area, making sure that the line that I used for that circle was a little bit lighter or thinner than the other lines that I had used before. This helps me create that line weight variation that is so important when we're working with pen and ink. And I've talked about line weight variation before in other pen and ink videos, which I'll make sure to link to down below as well. But line weight variation simply refers to making sure that you're using lighter or thinner lines and marks in some areas and darker and thicker lines and marks in other areas. This leads to a more interesting, dynamic look when you're working with pen and ink and creating line drawings. At this point, I'm starting to add little extra details and textures throughout the flower, starting with little scribbles and marks to create a little bit of texture in the central area. Sometimes it's more of a stippling motion, and other times I'm almost drawing a little teeny tiny circle or creating little scribbles. It's all about thinking of which type of mark or line can help you best convey the texture of the area on hand. But it's not necessary to overdo it or feel like you have to fill sections up with detail or texture. And then it was time to add in a little bit more detail into the flower petals. And I just very loosely went in with quick kind of flicking motions. Sometimes I'm making my way from the outermost point of the petal in, and other times it's from the inner point out that I am working toward, but I'm always using these quicker flicking motions to make sure that the lines that I'm creating are thinner and lighter looking than the lines that I created around the edges of the petal shapes. I'm also trying to create slight curves in these lines so that I don't create any stiffness in these petals. I added in the flower stem, making sure that it is relatively aligned to that central section of the flower, because the base of the flower is right behind that, and that is what the stem is connected to. Let's talk about a different perspective or angle that we could be seeing this circle flower from. It is so important that when we're learning to draw flowers, we practice different angles and perspectives, because when we are creating pieces where we are going to be including flowers, we don't want to be drawing only one type of perspective throughout the entire piece. That's not going to look very natural. When we see flowers, whether they are out in nature in a field or in a flower bouquet or anything, those flowers are going to be going off in all sorts of different angles and directions. So we don't want to handicap ourselves. As I said before, when it comes to this flower shape, there is a certain flatness to them when we see them from a profile view, which is what I am drawing right now. With all of these flower shapes that we're going to be practicing in this series, I want you to constantly ask yourself, what would this flower structure look like from profile view, from a top-down view, at a 3/4 angle view? Start developing that ability to visualize what three-dimensional structures would look like when viewed from different angles or perspectives. This is such an important skill to develop when you're learning to draw, because everything that we have around us is three-dimensional. And if you're ever in doubt, go ahead and look up reference photos. So as you can see, I started my drawing with simple shapes again, simplifying everything as much as possible. And then I broke up those shapes into smaller shapes, which in this case would be the petals and that central portion of the flower. And once I was happy with that, I started adding in more imperfection. I added in a couple of extra petals, and I am now starting to add in extra lines and marks for a little bit more detail and texture. And at the end, I add in some extra petals just to make things a little bit more imperfect and natural. All right, so now that we have practiced the top-down or front view, which is pretty flat, and also the profile view, let's go ahead and try to draw this same flower, but at a 3/4 angle. I'm also going to make it a little bit tilted so that I can challenge myself. When we're seeing this type of flower at a different angle like this, all of a sudden the circle turns into an ellipse. Once again, my ellipse is not perfect. It looks more like an oval. That doesn't matter because these are just shapes that I am using to get something down on paper and start visualizing the flower and the proportions that I need. Once my larger ellipse or oval is in, I go ahead and add in the central section of the flower as a smaller ellipse or oval inside of the larger one. And as you can see, I avoided centering that smaller oval inside of the larger one. I placed it a little bit closer to one of the edges, in this case the right edge, than to the left edge. This is important because when you're seeing this flower from this perspective or something similar, that smaller ellipse or oval is not going to be perfectly centered within the larger one. Once my ovals were in, it was time to once again start drawing the petal shapes in that area created in between these ovals. I had the same things in mind that I was mentioning before, only in this case, some of those petal shapes, especially the ones that are coming toward us and the ones that are receding away, become foreshortened. So they're no longer showing their full length, especially the petals that are coming toward us forward and the ones that are receding away from us. Notice how those petal shapes change and become distorted because of our vantage point and the angle or perspective that we're seeing this flower from. Something that helped me a lot in the beginning when I was trying to understand the petal shapes when they were distorted or foreshortened was printing out a reference photo and using a black Sharpie to trace around the petal shapes. Once again, make sure that you're bringing in a lot of irregularity, imperfection, and overlapping when you're drawing those petals, and you can add any details or textures that you might want to add. Make sure as well that when you're adding the stem, it looks like it's connected to the back of the central part of the flower, that base that I was talking about before. Let's move on to the second type of flower that I'm going to be covering today, which is the trumpet shape. For this one, I'm going to be sketching a morning glory, but in this category, we would also have petunias and some types of lilies. I would recommend practicing drawing a trumpet structure or a megaphone structure Before drawing this flower, all you have to do is draw a triangular shape that has two longer equal sides and one shorter side, and then draw a circle or an oval right along that shorter line or edge. That oval or ellipse is going to be the opening of the flower or the megaphone. And then what I did was I created some curved lines right along or below the lines that I created for my triangle, using those previous longer straight lines as guides. I erased my straight lines that I started with and created a small curve at the back of the megaphone. Okay, so I'm going to practice that once again, and I'm actually going to be turning this one into a morning glory. So I once again start with that triangular shape, which is, I guess, more of a trapezoid than a triangle. I draw my ellipse right along that shorter line, create that little curve at the back because this is a tapered cylinder, so that would imply a curve at the bottom as well. I erase those unnecessary lines that I no longer need, and I start making modifications or cutting into this structure and make any refinements that I need to make to turn this into the flower on hand. I started by drawing a curved line in the opening of the flower to help me represent that hole there. Then I created my curves along the sides of the flower structure using those straight lines that I had previously created as guides. You can see how I brought in these slightly curved lines a little bit more than the previous megaphone structure that I was practicing. And this is because the tapered cylinder for this flower is a little bit more narrow. And then I started adding in the other necessary elements to turn this into the flower on hand, the little leaves at the bottom and the base there, and also separating out the petals. For this type of flower, or really any flower where there are fewer petals involved, it's very important that we actually observe reference photos and count the petals that we should be adding in. This isn't as important when we're drawing or painting flowers that have a lot of petals in them, such as the one that I'm going to be drawing next. When flowers have a lot of different petals, we can get away with not adding them all in, or even changing petals or adding extra ones if we feel that that might add to the drawing and improve it. But when it comes to flowers with fewer petals like this one, we don't want to accidentally add an extra petal or two because that is a very distinctive characteristic for this type of flower. Once I was happy with my pencil sketch, I went ahead and started with my pen and ink techniques, really trying to avoid that flat coloring book page kind of style where the outlines are very thick and bold and all those lines have that same weight or that same thickness to them, because that leads to a lot of flatness. So again, I'm trying to create that line weight variation where certain sections are thicker and darker and others are lighter and thinner. And before moving on to a slightly different perspective, I want to just ask you, what do you think this particular flower would look like from a top-down view? If we were standing right above this flower, right above the opening, what would that look like if we were looking down? So this is just a quick exercise that I'm doing here, a visualization exercise, if you will. So in this case, I would visualize a circle and the opening of the flower would be right in the middle of it. So I create a second smaller circle inside of that larger one. And then I start breaking up that larger circle into the amount of petals that I need. So we kind of have that concentric circle situation again, just like with the circle flower. But we know that with the trumpet flower, when we see it from a profile view and we actually see the entire structure of it, it's a lot taller, it has a lot more depth. All right, so let's work on one last perspective for this flower before jumping onto the final one that I'm gonna be covering today. I'm drawing this one from a little bit more of a 3/4 angle where we're able to see a little bit more into the flower. So I started with a wider or more open ellipse or oval, and I shortened the length of it because from this angle, things would become foreshortened. We would see the full length of this flower if we were observing it from a profile view. But from this perspective, we don't see that full length. And that opening part of the flower with the petals kind of curving out cover up a good portion of that length. So I want to make sure that I'm not overly elongating that bottom shape behind the oval, because otherwise I would throw the perspective off. Once I was happy with my pencil sketch, I brought out my pen and I got started with my pen and ink techniques once again. You can see here how I am using curved lines as I am separating out those petals. By using curved lines, I am enhancing the curvature in that structure, as opposed to straight lines, which would flatten things out. Let's move on to the third type of flower that I'm going to teach you how to draw today, which is the bowl-shaped flower. And for this one, I'm going to be drawing a peony, but other flowers that would fit into this category would be begonias, dahlias, and marigolds. Just like with the previous flower, I would recommend practicing drawing a bowl form before trying to draw the flower. So I always start with the oval or ellipse for the opening on top. Then I create a little tick mark right underneath that oval or ellipse, as centered as possible, so that I can visualize how tall I want that bowl to be. Once I have that little tick mark there under the ellipse, I can create little sections of diagonal lines to connect the left edge of the ellipse and the right edge of the ellipse to that little tick mark in the bottom center. You can see how I'm not trying to create perfect curves. I'm actually creating short straight lines and just bringing them together. This is easier for me to draw and helps me create more of a symmetrical look. Alright, so I'm going to repeat this process, and I'm actually going to be turning this one into a peony now. You can change the proportions of that bowl as needed if you want to make your peony look more open or more closed or shorter or taller. Once you have drawn your bowl structure, it's time to start drawing our petals. And peonies have lots of larger or medium-sized petals, and they're kind of curving in. With this kind of flower, I usually start with the largest petals or the largest shapes for the petals that I'm able to see from my vantage point, which would obviously be the ones closest to us in the front central section. So I start with that front central one, and then I make my way toward the left and the right, creating those petal shapes, and then I make my way in. As you're going toward the center, it's important to visualize where that closed bulb in that central part would be. And you can even create a little curve right there in the middle so that you are reminded of where that bulb is. Because with this kind of flower, the petals are curving around that bulb, creating a little kind of house around that, if you will. And then the more you go toward the outer edges, the more open those petals become. And that knowledge can help you better draw those petal shapes. You can see how I'm adding a lot of irregularity in those petals, especially in the top. I'm making sure to create irregular edges. And once I'm happy with how things are looking, I add in a couple of extra petals outside of that initial bowl form that I created, right along the left and right edges of the flower. I think this adds a little bit more asymmetry and imperfection, which are going to make this look more natural. And then it was time to start inking things in. And notice the curved lines that I add inside of the petal shapes, which helps enhance their curvature. In just a bit, I'm going to be drawing another peony seen from a slightly different angle, more of a 3/4 view, where we can see a little bit more into the flower. And that one is going to be a little bit more open. This is closer to a profile view, not quite a profile view because we are able to see into the bowl. And it's also more closed than the peony that we're going to be drawing next. All right, I'm almost done with my inking. I'm going to allow a minute or two to pass, and then I'm going to erase my graphite with a soft graphite eraser. And now let's draw the peony from a different angle. This is that almost 3/4 view that I was talking about before, where you're actually able to see more into the flower. And this peony is a little bit more open. I like starting out by laying down a couple of circles and also a line to help me visualize the tilt of the flower. I start with the larger circle. I then add in this line or this axis to help me visualize the tilt that I'm going to be drawing the flower at. And then I draw a smaller circle inside of the larger one, but this smaller circle is actually touching or right along one of the edges of the larger circle. And I use the axis that I have placed to help me center that circle where I need it to be. The smaller circle is going to represent or help me visualize that innermost bulb of that flower that opens up until the flower is in full bloom. And the larger circle is going to help me visualize where to place the other petals that have opened up. Sometimes placing little arrows like this is helpful because they help remind you of the curvature that those petals should have as you're drawing those shapes. Remember that with peonies and tulips as well, those petals are really curved in, kind of hugging that centralmost section, protecting that center of that flower. So that curvature that you create in your shapes needs to communicate that. All right, so once I've laid down these helpful shapes and lines and I have started visualizing how everything is going to be and where the different parts of the flower are, it is now time to start actually drawing my petals. And I start with the ones in the exterior that have opened up most for this type of flower. I know that these are going to be pretty large shapes. I start with the one in the middle that would sit right over that axis that I have drawn for myself. And then I add in 2 or 3 more petals to the left and right of that, using that larger circle as a guide. And you can see how even at this point, I'm trying to incorporate some level of imperfection as I am starting to overlap my petal shapes, making shapes slightly different from each other, sometimes overlapping them in different ways. And when it comes to this flower, you're going to notice that I add in an extra little shape right along the outermost edge of that petal to help convey a little bit of that curvature that happens with this type of flower. I don't need to add this extra shape to all of my petals, but I make sure to add it into some. Once I have added in the outermost petals, I also make sure to add in 1 or 2 middle petals, which would sit in between the petals that the larger circle allowed me to create and the ones that I'm going to be drawing in the smaller circle. You definitely want to add at least 1 or 2 in between because this is going to help create a fuller look. And you want those transition petals in the middle, in between the ones that are most open and the ones that are more closed. And then when it comes to the petals in the smaller circle, I start with the larger shapes and then I make my way back, making sure that I add in little teeny tiny shapes for the ones that are most closed right in the center. Once I'm happy with my pencil sketch, I go ahead and switch on over to my pen once again and start working on my pen and ink techniques. I start with the outer edges of my petals, making sure that I understand which petal is overlapping which, because I don't want to trace over any edges that actually wouldn't be visible because they would be covered up by another petal that is sitting on top. Once I finished tracing over the edges of my shapes that I created in pencil, I allow everything to dry. I erase out my graphite with a soft graphite eraser, and I add in a couple of extra petals for more irregularity and asymmetry, and I start adding in a few more curved lines and little details to complete this little study. Once again, I make sure to use curved lines to help me convey the curvature in these petals. So we're officially done with our practice sketches, and it is time to create the finished studies on actual watercolor paper. I'm going to be working on hot press watercolor paper from Arches today. This is 140 pounds in thickness or in weight, and it is 100% cotton. I'm going with hot press watercolor paper today, which is the smoothest type of watercolor paper that you can find because I am bringing in a drawing pen, and it's just easier to draw on that smoother surface. I'm going to be practicing at least a couple of different angles or perspectives for each of the 3 flowers in this final piece. So I do want to make sure to have enough space for all of these, starting with the circle-shaped flower, which is the daisy. For all of these, I'm going through the exact same process that I was going through before. I'm starting out with my pencil sketch, making sure that I'm drawing as lightly as possible, especially now that I am working on the final ones and on watercolor paper. I don't want to draw too dark with my graphite pencil. I don't want to scratch or damage that watercolor paper. And I do want to be able to erase that graphite fully before moving on to the watercolor washes. I would recommend using something like an HB pencil and making sure that you're not pressing down too hard when you are sketching right on your watercolor sheet. Starting out with my graphite sketch, then defining the edges of my larger shapes with my pen, and then finally adding in smaller textures and details. I'm also going through these in the same order as well, just because for me, this first one is the easiest, and then the trumpet is the medium one, and then the most challenging is the bowl-shaped flower. I try not to do too much erasing on my watercolor sheet and keep it protected, which is why it's so important to do that practice separately before jumping into practicing on a more expensive watercolor sheet. And I want to encourage you to practice your flowers in different perspectives at different angles. Maybe you have drawn one flower going off or looking off toward one direction. You can try doing the opposite direction. But whenever you feel you need extra practice, go ahead and practice in your sketchbook or a separate sheet of drawing paper. Unless, of course, you're working on cheaper, more student-grade paper or a watercolor sketchbook that isn't too expensive and you don't mind using that. I'm going to go quiet for a bit while I continue working on the drawing process, and I'll be coming back to explain further once I'm ready to get started with the watercolor washes. All right, finishing up with my pen and ink here. And once I'm done, I'm going to allow everything to dry for a few minutes, and I'm going to erase out all of my pencil work. Once I'm done there, I bring out the paintbrushes that I feel are appropriate for these shapes and shape sizes that I'm going to be painting in. And I go with a couple of rounds from Winsor & Newton's 111 line, and these are in sizes 8 and 4. These are simple watercolor washes that we're going to be doing today. We want to keep everything light and fresh, so don't be too finicky or try to overly correct little mistakes or textures that happen along the way. I just go in with one single layer for these quick paintings, and I'm going to tell you the paint colors that I used for each flower, but don't feel that you need to use these exact same paint colors or even similar colors to the ones that I am using. If you want to use different colors, then I would recommend looking up reference photos for the flower on hand and just making sure that you're picking a color or creating a color mixture to paint that flower in a color that you would find that flower in. All right, so the orange color that I created for this first daisy is a mixture of Pyrrole Scarlet from Daniel Smith and lemon yellow from Winsor & Newton's Professional line. I mixed those two colors together to create a bit of a lighter, more yellow-orange color, and I used my size 8 round brush to start painting in those petals. Once I painted in those petals, I removed all of that yellow-orange from my paintbrush bristles, and I painted in that central section with raw sienna. And while that raw sienna was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of burnt sienna to darken certain sections. And you can see how I got some bleeding there in the central section because I am painting so quickly. The yellow from the petals hadn't dried yet. So when I started painting in those browns in the center, the yellow started seeping into the new area of wetness. But I am just embracing any bleeding that happens because this is a looser, more expressive style, and I am embracing those little imperfections. Once I finished with the petals and the central section, I switched to my smaller size 4 round brush, and I painted in the stem using my green, and this is a green from St. Petersburg White Knights. I believe this is called Russian green, and it is a deeper, rich, warm green. The second daisy I painted with a little bit of a reddish orange color. To create this color, I mixed together Pyrrole Scarlet from Daniel Smith and New Gamboge from Winsor & Newton. Once I painted in the petals, I used the exact same colors that I used for the previous daisy to paint in that central section, which were my raw sienna, which is a light golden kind of beige brown. I painted that in quickly, and then while that was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of burnt sienna here and there to darken certain sections and create a little bit of a tonal variation within that central part. Once I was done there, I used that beautiful deep green from St. Petersburg to paint that stem once again. I'm going to be using the same green to paint in all the stems. In some cases, some of my colors are going to start seeping into my green, and that green is going to become lighter or more desaturated, depending on the color that is mixing into it. So those are my 2 daisies painted in, and it is time to move on to painting the morning glories. And for these flowers, I'm going to be using purple hues. Sometimes the purple is going to look more like a secondary purple, other times it's going to look more like a blue purple, and other times it's going to look more like a red purple, depending on the ratios of the colors in my mixture. For my purples, I mixed together Madder Lake Red Light from St. Petersburg White Knights and French Ultramarine from Winsor & Newton's Professional line. If you mix approximately 50% red and 50% blue, you're going to get more like a secondary purple. And if it has more red in it, it's going to look more like a red purple. And if it has more blue in it, it's going to look more like a blue purple. You can use whatever you'd like, but I would recommend developing a little bit of a range of different hues throughout those petals. Meaning, have certain areas look more like a red purple or a blue purple, and others look more like a middle of the range, more secondary purple. Whatever you prefer, just have a slight range at least. And it's very helpful to use a darker value or darker hue in those areas that would have shadow in them, like in the hole in the center of that flower, or right beneath the curving petals. In this case, I'm using more blue in those shadow areas. This is going to lead to a more natural and interesting look, as opposed to just having one flat color all throughout. Something I'm also making sure to do, especially in this flower and the one that is coming up next, is I go in with a pretty watered down color initially so that I can build darker values on that and develop that range of values that I need for a more believable look. If I go right in with a very thick saturated color mixture where there's very little water in that, that is going to look very heavy and very dark and very flat. Whereas if I initially go in with my color relatively watered down in like a tea or coffee consistency, I can then darken certain areas over that, developing that range of values that I need. If I accidentally go in and start painting a very dark color in the beginning of the painting process for any one of these flowers, I immediately stop what I'm doing. I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles and go in with a clean and slightly damp brush, run my paintbrush bristles over that color, and that is going to help soften it and lighten that color. This second Morning Glory, I decide to paint in with a little bit more of a reddish purple color. So I mixed together my Madder Lake Red Light and my French Ultramarine, but this time it's heavier on the red. And I'm just painting everything in nice and quick and loose, trying to create a little bit of a darker value in shadow areas. And finally, when it comes to the peonies, I want to use a pinkish color. So I'm bringing in a little bit of my Madder Lake Red Light, which is the cool red that I was just using to create my purples for the Morning Glories. And I'm just going to be adding this cool red into this section of my palette where I already have a bit of an orange color there. I have some lemon yellow and some new gamboge. This is going to help warm up and simultaneously mute down that cool red just a tad. I'm looking for a color that looks pink when it is watered down. So I make sure to test out this color mixture on a scrap piece of watercolor paper and kind of pull out a little bit of that pigment with just water in my brush to see what it looks like at its most watered down. And I do want to make sure that I'm going in nice and watery for the peonies, because if I go in too thick, that color is going to look more like a red and not so much like a pink. So you can see how I painted the entire petal area in one go, making sure that that pink looked nice and pale. And while that initial lighter pink layer was still wet, I dropped in a little bit more of my Madder Lake Red Light into shadow areas in between those petals. I wanted to make sure to create a nice tonal variation in the petal area to make things look a little bit more believable. Because if I just leave everything in one flat color or value all throughout that petal area, things are going to look very flat. So I'm always looking to develop a nice range of values, especially in flowers like the Morning Glory or this one that I'm painting right now, where the petals are all overlapping and they're not visually separate like with the daisy. We want to make sure that everything doesn't look like one same blob in one flat color or value. Once I'm done painting in those pink petals, I paint in that stem with my green and my smaller round brush. And then it's time to paint in my last peony. You can see how once again I'm making sure to go in with a relatively pale and watered down cool red so that I can then build on that and develop darker shadow areas over that lighter pink while it's still wet. I want to make sure that I'm working quick and that I'm dropping in that second layer of paint over that lighter one while it's still wet so that I can get those nice soft wet on wet effects. If I work too slowly, then I'm going to get a splotchy look or defined edges around the shapes that I am painting in. I do personally live in a very dry and very warm environment. So what I like doing in order to have my first layer stay wet for a little bit longer is I make sure to run my paintbrush bristles with just a tiny bit of water in them over the entire shape or area that I'm looking to keep wet for a little bit longer. So I just spend a little bit longer on that initial layer, making sure that everything has a nice glistening look, and then I go ahead and start developing my darker values. Once again, I switch on over to my smaller round brush to paint in that stem, and I am all done with these line and wash flower studies. Alright you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!